When you view an infotext, webinar, or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you are agreeing to the terms posted at the webpage listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what infotext presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with infotext webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but Infotext reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our Transfer of Copyright Agreement at the webpage listed in the slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the webpage shown on the slide.
Hi, Dan Hadaway here, Managing Partner of Infotext, and I have the pleasure today to introduce one of our regular speakers, Adam Reynolds.
Wow, Dan, thanks for that introduction. Hi, I'm Adam Reynolds, and I'm the lead non-technical auditor here at Infotext. Thank you for joining us today for this movie titled Vendor Management, an Overview. Today's agenda includes understanding third-party risk, the 5 precepts used to manage that risk, and the tools used by financial institutions to carry out that process. If you're just getting started in vendor management, or you want to revisit the basics as part of an awareness process, this webinar will review the risks, the 5 requirements for higher critical risk vendors, and why we adhere to them. Starting off with third-party risk. Customers give us information that we share with third parties. It's really as simple as that. We have our customers' information, we must protect it, whether that's in-house or outsourced. Outsourcing does not relieve us of the ultimate responsibility of ensuring that customer information is protected. And let me mention the term there, third parties. There is a difference between vendors, third parties, and suppliers and service providers. But throughout this presentation, I will be using third party and vendor interchangeably to mean, as the OCC puts it, any business arrangement between a bank and another entity. And that's an example of something I'll talk about here shortly, but one thing we like about the OCC guidance, even though we typically focus on the FFIEC, is that the OCC's is concise and to the point, and provides great references on vendor management processes for specific subjects. While not knocking the FFIEC's approach, their guidance is spread out over many documents and booklets, approaching vendor management as a smaller part to larger guidances on specific subjects, which makes explaining vendor management at a higher level a little harder. As mentioned, there are 2 regulatory bodies we will be speaking about, primarily the FFIEC guidances, as those are what our audits are based around, and then the OCC, which is a great framework for vendor management itself. Starting with the FFIEC, which does include the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, National Credit Union Administration, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And according to the FFIEC guidelines, well, it would be hard to present what the FFIEC guidelines say at a high level. They present their guidances spread out over many documents and booklets which are specific to those guidance areas. The guidelines on vendor risk management are included in different forms in multiple IT booklets published by the FFIEC, including specific subjects such as retail and wholesale payment systems, business continuity management, architecture infrastructure operations, etc. The FFIEC is clear though. Financial institutions must understand the complex nature of arrangements with outside parties and ensure adequate due diligence for the engagement of the relationship and ongoing monitoring. The OCC guidance, Third-Party Relationships Risk Management Guidance, published in October of 2013, as we'll see, the bulletin provides guidance to national banks and federal savings associations for assessing and managing risks associated with third-party relationships. They expect a bank to practice effective risk management regardless of whether the bank performs the activity internally or through a third party. A bank's use of third parties does not diminish the responsibility of its board of directors and senior management to ensure that activity is performed in a safe and sound manner and in compliance with applicable laws. Their top-down approach to vendor management consolidates all of the previous guidances and was very well written. As mentioned, the bulletin provides guidance on assessing and managing third-party relationships. That is, any business arrangement between a bank and another entity. In the highlights, we see that the risk management process we adopt should always be commensurate with the level of risk and complexity of the third-party relationships. We want to see a comprehensive risk management and oversight involving critical activities. These will be discussed later as we go over the 5 precepts, but it outlines what should be included in the vendor management process throughout the life cycle, having ongoing monitoring and due diligence processes after the vendor has been put in place. And then we also have a note for community banks, noting that risk management practices be commensurate with the level of risk and complexity to those third-party relationships. And following, it's the board and management's responsibility to identify those relationships that involve critical activities so they can properly address them through assessment, monitoring, and management. Most community banks follow a similar top-down approach as seen here. The vendor management policy, approved by the board, sits at the top and outlines the requirements for the procedure, which in turn details how vendor risk will be handled through reporting and due diligence processes of the vendor files, which are a cyclical process. And here's an example of a vendor management policy. The policy outlines the scope of the document, applying to all third-party vendors that sell or provide services. I'm not going to go into detail here, but suffice it to say, the policy lays out the requirements needed to effectively address vendor risk. The objectives. The governing threshold, which we will talk about later, is how we group vendors into different levels based on their risk, and defines what due diligence and other requirements are needed for each level. It also lays out the requirements for vendor owners, the specific individual who is responsible for the vendor relationship, as well as ongoing monitoring, due diligence reviews, vendor termination, and policy training. The vendor management procedure then is how we actually accomplish those objectives in the policy, and basically details the specific actions needed to comply with the policy, fleshing out details on vendor levels, governing threshold, components, managing requirements, vendor documentation, contract reviews, contract provisions, and further information. Inherent risk comes from the vendor, and we say it's vendor-centric. This is the risk the vendor poses before we start to review their mitigating controls. Residual risk is issue-centric, focusing on a specific issue. Residual risk is never higher than inherent risk, as it's the risk with mitigating controls in place, which lower the risk. Residual risk is issue-centric, as it's the risk that is left over due to a control not being in place. So it's really the risk due to the issue of controls not being in place, and to address the residual risk, you put specific controls in place to address a specific issue. And when there is high inherent risk, we pull out all the stops in the due diligence process. And when there is high inherent risk, we exude that we understand how vendor due diligence is supposed to work, as it will be the most complex to address. One thing we also need to discuss is the governing threshold, how you decide what vendor due diligence is required. So the complexity of the due diligence process for what groups or levels of vendors, and this is of course based on risk. Does the vendor host or possess NPI? Do they instead just have access to NPI? Do they have access to lower levels of classified information such as critical or confidential? And then the expenditure threshold. If we're spending a large amount of money with a vendor, we want the due diligence process to show it was a financially responsible decision that does not leave us open to unacceptable or unknown risks. These questions are used to fit vendors into 3 groups, excluding the expenditure threshold, as that should be automatically triggered by that set threshold. There are then 3 types of vendors: those with possession of information, those with access to information, and those with availability concerns. And when I discuss possession or access to information, I'm primarily talking about customer information or higher critical labeled information. Customer information is at the top, of course. We always need to do the highest level of due diligence there. This is risk-based. We're not going to worry that our vendors have access to our public website. Obviously, the difference between possession and access are in the name. But we want to state that while both require a certain level of trust in a vendor, possession or hosting of information requires more trust as it's riskier than just access. It also differentiates between who has control. Obviously, if the vendor is in control of the information, then our guarantees on the protection of that information comes down to the due diligence process, making sure the vendor has the proper controls in place to protect it. As we can see, there are a lot of groups, individuals, and processes that are required for effective management. Starting at the top with the board, going through the information security officer to the vendor and or third-party due diligence provider if outsourced, which branch out to different entities. While trying to illustrate the many parts of vendor management, this also illustrates why vendor management processes, especially due diligence, can take some time, and it's important to request documents such as SOC 2 reports early on in the process. The procedure. The procedure has 3 vendor phases, starting off with search and selection. This process happens before we add the vendor into accounts payable. We must have some basis for the selection of the vendor. The complexity of the process depends on the risk. Again, possession, access, and availability, the big drivers there, and then cost. It should not depend on any other factors. If the risk and or cost is high enough, it needs to be addressed through the highest level of due diligence. There should be no exceptions or other factors that would lower the level of due diligence required. Once the vendor has been selected, the contract process starts. We want to ensure the contracts outline the rights and responsibilities of all parties and are known to all parties. Contract review is one of the 5 precepts of vendor management, and we will discuss that in more detail later. And again, complexity of the process depends upon cost and risk. After the vendor is in place, there's always going to be ongoing work. We need to make sure the vendor is living up to their contract and expectations. And ongoing monitoring of activities and performance ensure that. Proper risk management. Risk can arise from many things after the contract is signed. A good example would be changes in law or guidance. With the Architecture, Infrastructure, and Operations booklet, multi-factor authentication is stressed. And so we have updated our own vendor management program to reevaluate our cloud providers periodically for multi-factor authentication support. A lot of our providers did have MFA when we initially set them up, but a number of them did not have multi-factor authentication in place when we originally signed up. So as part of the ongoing process, we are currently reviewing our vendors who did not implement multi-factor authentication before on an annual basis to see if we should implement that when it's offered. And that was an overview of third-party risk. Moving on to the 5 precepts. Here we see the 5 precepts: assurance, contract, insurance, financials, and business continuity plans. Starting with assurance. Assurance gives us the ability to sleep at night, as we say at Infotex. It's the documents we use to determine if the vendor has the correct controls in place to protect the information we give them, as we need to ensure they have the same level of controls that we would have in place if it were not outsourced. And a typical document we use for this is the SOC 2, Service Organization Controls Type 2 report, which should verify that an organization is following some specific best practices before we outsource a business function to that organization, and reviewed annually for high risk or critical vendors. It provides detailed information and assurance about a service organization's security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and or privacy controls. If the vendor does not have the proper controls in place to protect information, we must either address those items before we move into the contract phase or look for another vendor. Contracts should be reviewed for items including cost, scope of services, security and confidentiality agreements, breach notification requirements, sub-service providers, termination and renewal clause, as well as data retention and destruction. They should be clearly written and sufficiently detailed to provide assurances for performance, reliability, security, confidentiality, and reporting. Contracts between the institution and service provider should take into account business requirements and key risk factors identified during the risk assessment and due diligence phases. Management should consider whether the contract is flexible enough to allow for changes in technology and the financial institution's operations. Appropriate legal counsel should also review the contracts prior to signing. Insurance. One way to handle risk is to transfer it, which is the purpose of insurance. Management should assess the adequacy of the service provider's insurance coverage, including such things as fidelity, fire, liability, data losses from omissions and errors, and protection of documents in transit. Again, if the risk warrants it. Depending on the vendor, it's also important to review how the insurance covers cyber incidents or breach notifications. The incident response process may be relying on certain assumed coverages or responses from the vendor in such incidents. It's important to review and make sure we understand what is and what isn't covered, as well as the responsibilities of each party, so that if we ever need to rely on our insurance during an incident, we know exactly how that will work. Financials are our way to ensure the vendor will be around for the long haul. This is typically handled by a credit analyst who is familiar with reviewing such information. This is especially important for our providers of critical IT services, as switching providers is typically not a quick or painless process. High and critical risk vendors should have their financial statements and certificates of insurance reviewed to ensure the vendor can financially support itself and to continue to provide the services as in the contract. Business continuity plans. This is where we address availability concerns. We want to ensure the vendors have an adequate business continuity plan, and those plans are tested, so that if there ever is a business continuity event at the vendor, they can respond accordingly and still be able to provide us with their services. Your network administrator typically has a better understanding of business continuity requirements, especially as it relates to services provided over the internet, and should be conducting the review of the business continuity plans and testing. So here are the 5 precepts again: assurance, contract, insurance, financials, and business continuity plans. This is what we look at for every vendor of high or critical risk. As always, this is dependent on risk. Additionally, we have a number of movies that drill down further on assurance, contract, and insurance reviews. We do not have drill down movies on financial reviews, as that is not our area of expertise, and again, should normally rely on your internal team who already has experience in these types of reviews. Finally, for business continuity plan reviews, again, this should be conducted by your network administrator. And if you're using a third party, your application for your due diligence process, they will typically drive the review of the business continuity plan. And now, moving on from the 5 precepts, tools used for vendor management. Spreadsheets are how we started to track vendor risk and due diligence processes, and most likely, those listening are either still using them or have moved to a third-party system, but were using spreadsheets at one point. And there's nothing wrong with still using spreadsheets, but it can become a tedious process, and financial institutions as a whole are outsourcing more, which means more vendors, higher risk vendors, and therefore more work in general to manage them. And oftentimes, you might just not have the time to collect your vendor's due diligence material, review them all, understand them all, and create reports for each vendor. That's where vendor management tools come into play. And there are many vendors out there, and they can play many different roles, from handling due diligence document requests or reviews of critical vendors, to managing the whole due diligence process. The most common ones we encounter at smaller community-based institutions are VendMinder, NContracts, and Tandem by Conetrix. VendMinder, as the name might suggest, focuses on vendor management. While most of the other providers also have other risk and compliance management solutions, VendMinder is primarily dedicated to vendor risk management. And here's an overview of their dashboard, which will be similar across most vendors. There's a way to add vendors, assess vendors, store documents, view reports. As this example is showing, VendMinder is doing the assessment process for their client, and then will report their findings back to them. NContracts, or really NVendor, which is their vendor risk module, is also a popular choice. And as we can see here, similar interface, this time showing an example of a Tier 1 vendor profile, tracking things to do, OFAC warnings, and residual risk assessments, really the vendor management process. And finally, tandem by Conetrix. And again, these dashboards are going to look similar because they're all providing similar services: oversight, risk assessment, and reporting to varying degrees. But when we talk about checklists, ours are typically checklists that come from spreadsheets. But this is where vendor management software would come in, with their own checklists and such. They manage the workflow of vendor management. They know what information they need to determine risk, what to ask. They know the process and, when questions need to be asked in that process. They can store all of your documents from reports to due diligence material and can then use that to assess risk. And finally, as an example of end contracts assistance, they handle the assurance. They will walk you through that process. And similar for contract review, which you can outsource the contract review out as well. Insurance will most likely be a checklist, where you're reviewing the insurance document for particular items such as limits and sublimits. Financials can typically be handled in-house. We've got the people for it. And then business continuity plans, which again, your network administrator can review, or you can outsource that process to end contracts as well. And this finishes up vendor management, an overview of the risks, 5 precepts for managing those risks, and the tools out there to manage the process. As always, thank you for listening to this InfoTex presentation.